All right, so as I mentioned last week, and for those of you that weren't here last week, or this is your first evening at Bible class, I won't make too many apologies. I'll just sort of assume that you can catch on, and if you're not up to speed with what I'm talking about, you can ask people at your table some questions. But what I was saying last week to those of you that are regulars at the class is that it would be a good week to invite new people along, given that Chronicles the entire history of the Israelite nation, even their prehistory, which is our prehistory. And so for those that were a little concerned about maybe joining in with the Bible class for fear that it's already started and it's a long way in and they didn't want to come in halfway through, this should be a really good intro, isn't it? Basically everything that's taken place throughout the history of Israel up until this point, and actually a little bit further into the future. We'll discuss that in a moment. So what I wanted to do, rather than immediately go into our group conversation, which is where we generally start, I wanted to, with your assistance, walk through the history of Israel, starting with Genesis 1, so the prehistory of Israel as well. And then once we've done that, we're going to get straight into an activity which I imagine for the vast majority of us, even if we've never been to the Bible class, you'd be able to participate in. So I'm hoping those that have turned up tonight can feel like they can participate in this particular activity. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. What I want to do is I want to start with the very start. And well, that's because that's where Chronicles starts. It starts. What's the opening word? Adam. Yeah, right at the start. Maybe the only further back you could go, or what would be, how much further back could you go? What would you start with? Yeah, you could go, that's the beginning of time and matter. What goes before that? God, yeah. So maybe you could start with God. But there's one other book in the Old Testament anyway. There's another one actually in the New Testament that starts right at the start. Which book is that? No, forget New Testament, and it's Luke. We're thinking Old Testament. I'm not trying to trick you. You guys know this. This is Genesis. Absolutely. Yeah. In the beginning.
We were thinking of Genesis.
Now I know you knew it, Kari. You just didn't want to be like proud. Yeah, I know. So. Can you tell the others that are here for the first time, why did the author of Genesis start at the beginning? Like, what was his intention for doing that? Thinking about the context of the original readers, why would have he started there?
Where else did he start?
Sorry?
Where else did he start?
Yeah, that's a good point. There are lots of books, however, that do pick up in history from a particular point in time that isn't necessarily the very start. There was a particular reason. We discussed this at length. Okay, so the original readers of First Genesis were captives of Egypt. But so why is that significant, Max?
400 years, they've forgotten their story, didn't know their story.
Okay, so we've got the Israelites living in Egypt for 400 years. They're basically Egyptian. In the same way that we would be basically Chinese if we were all shipped off to China in 400 years. You know what I mean? And so, as a means to re-identify God's people with himself, he gets the author of Genesis to start right at the start. And that anchors them directly to Yahweh God. Okay? Now the chronicler, he's starting right at the start. Why?
Isn't he trying to draw a thread?
Trying to do the exact same thing. Now, what's similar about the people, the original audience of Chronicles to the original audience of Genesis? Yeah, they've both been living in exile. Exactly. The first group, 400 years over in Egypt, they're basically Egyptian. This exiled group, they've had their national and religious identity completely torn from their arms. They've been carried out into Babylon, and they've been encouraged by even their own prophets to just embrace Babylon. Just go. And while they were only there for 70 years, this radical upheaval of being torn away from that which was given to them really caused them to ask the question, who are we? Like, are we God's people or not? Like, do we have a king or not? Like, is God still into us? So the chronicler, he wants to take him right back to the start and draw a thread that links them directly to the beginning. So, you guys can help me. Genesis 1 to 11, we have the prehistory of Israel. So we start with, what do we start with? Creation. Good. And we get animals and we get human beings. And what is the creation account focused on communicating to us? That the world was created in 6 days, right? No. No, that's right. The humans are a reflection of God. This is like mind blowing. We come from Egypt, where we're, we don't really know what we are. At best, we are to appease the gods if there is any kind of relationship, but not so that we can have a relationship, but so that they won't, curse us or oppress us or something. What? We're like a reflection of God. And, creation was good. So the question they're then asking is, well, if creation was good, what's going on here? Because Egypt's knackered. Okay, so what the author picks up after the prehistory of Israel going through the creation account, how sin entered the world and climaxed with Noah, and then God, cleaned it out, started again, and a couple of generations later, it's like, no, back to where we started. God sets some wheels in motion with a particular guy called Abraham. Exactly. Well, what was his original name? Abram, that's right. Yeah. And God gave him that name, Abraham. Now, this is God now saying to his people, I actually care so much about you that despite the fact that I created the good world and you guys ruined this good world, I am in hot pursuit of you. Even though you're not coming after me, I'm in hot pursuit of you. And I'm not going to do it the way that you guys do it, with big fancy cities and big fancy buildings and political systems. I'm just going to work through one man, Abraham. And so Abraham had a son of significance called Isaac. Yes, that's right. And then Isaac had a son of significance called, and God thought a better name would be, you guys are brilliant. He had a couple of sons. How many? Good. And there was something preeminent about one of them. Who was that guy? Joseph. Yeah, exactly. He was unlike any other human character we've seen in the story so far. He didn't do anything wrong. He seemed to do everything right. And it's like this pursuit that God has had of his people. It's almost like, hang on a second, maybe God's going to get a hold of his people through this Joseph character. And so we're left at the end of Genesis with this hope, God's going to fix stuff. And then we pick up at the start of Exodus 400 years later. And what's the opening lines there? Have a crack. Slavery. Was that Billy? Bill. I want to take it a step further and give another syllable. Okay, Bill. Bye, Ben. All right, so we've got this hope, and it's what, they're slaves? But then there's another detail there's a detail in there that gives us some hope. What's the detail? Before Moses, just right at the start of the story. They're enslaved, but they're really good at something. Breeding. Yes. All right. And now that takes us back to a promise that was made to Abraham. What was that promise? There's going to be lots of you. Now, when we were reading all of Abraham's story, there's not that many of them. They had one or two sons each, and then, you find out later down the track that, they had a few more than that, but the only sons of significance have all of a sudden turned into potentially 2 million people, depending on how you want to interpret the data. Okay, so there's 2 million people, they're enslaved, and then God does something astronomical that lays a foundation for their national identity from that day until today, 2019. He does something huge through Moses. What's that? A couple of days before the covenant month, about. How does he do it? Yes, through the chaotic waters. It's like he baptizes them out of something chaotic into something beautiful. And there's that motif that starts to get repeated time and again. So now we've got God's people in the wilderness, and all of a sudden God goes, now I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. I didn't just create this world good, but I created this world with order. And here is the order, and here's how it works. And they all go, oh, well, we're knackered if that's what the order is, because we can't do any of what you've said, God. And so he immediately backs it up with something. So the law is the order, sacrificial system. Wow. Okay, this God's thinking. Like he knows us. He knows that we can't keep the law. There's no way we can keep the law. But he wants to have a relationship with us, and the only way for us to have a relationship with God is to be holy, and the only way to be holy is through the law. But none of us are going to be able to do it through the law. And God goes, no, stop stressing. I know. Sacrificial system. I'm a gracious God. And all of a sudden, it's like the big bad God of the Old Testament. It's like, maybe not so big and bad. Definitely big. Don't want to mess with him. But he's good. Really, really good. And so all of a sudden, Israel starts to gain not only a national identity and a religious identity, but with the sacrificial law and the completion of the tabernacle, God's holy presence comes and dwells with his people. And all of a sudden, it's like, God is doing what he promised he would do. He's pursuing his people, and he's doing it. Like he's there. His holy presence is there with them in the tabernacle. And now they can come and face him because he has set up a system by which to be made holy. And so Moses says, listen, it's about time you guys go and inhabit that promised land that was promised to Abraham. Just so you know, the deal that we've got going with God is if we do what he says, we're good. If we do what he says we shouldn't do, then we're in all sorts of strife. And so we get the book of Joshua, which largely presents a picture of Israel doing what God said. Planning out the promised land, inhabiting the land, obeying God. Then we get 200 or 300 years of history under the rulership of the... Right, you guys are nailing this. And what is the story in Judges communicating to us? Correct? What's that for me, who doesn't remember? Bunch of warlords, yeah. Yeah. So the judges maybe could be better described as warlords, most of them, yeah. But what's the cycle that... Who just said that, Tom? No. David. Of course. Well, Dave, why don't you tell us? You know what it is. Okay, so Israel would sin, and so what would God do? Punish them, great. And then because they were punished, Israel would do something. Well, they would repent. Funny that. Okay? It's like, wow, this God's nasty, he's punishing them. No, not at all. He knows that if he punishes them, they'll repent. And as a result of their repentance, what did God do for them? He would bless them and give them peace. Then what would they do? Yeah, that's where we get our cycle. We get 12 cycles. Or we get 6 articulated anyway. Okay, so under the leadership of the judges, the Israelites become a little bit fed up. And so they say to their final judge, who was also a prophet, whose name was Great, we want a... And Samuel says, why isn't it a good idea? Tax you, enslave you, what else? Send your sons off to war. God wanted them to live in a promised land of peace, right? Not a war in there. They said, no, it's all good, thanks, we'll have the king. And so they get a king, his name is Saul. Okay, now it's at this point, the chronicler, he slows right down. He's ripped through Israel's history, not quite as fast as we did, and with slightly different details, but about that fast. And then he gets to Saul and he stops. Well, he doesn't stop, he just slows down. And it's at this point in the narrative of Chronicles that we learn, or we start to get a clearer picture of the intention of the chronicler. But we'll talk more about that in a moment through some of the exercises we're going to do. After Saul, who didn't turn out to be a great king, we get David. And a promise comes to David. What was that promise?
That his anointing wouldn't leave
Okay, his anointing wouldn't leave him. It was still somewhat conditional, but it reminds us of something that happens way back in Genesis 49. Who's, for an extra chocolate, going to tell me what that is? It's got to do with Jacob, who was named Israel, saying something particular to one of his sons. The sons of Judah will always hold the scepter. And which family did David come from? Sorry, I didn't have more chocolate. So, yeah. Now, Tom, if you're any kind of a gentleman, you'd bring that back to Karen. It's the cycle of the picnic. Okay, that's right. Israel says to Judah, this is 1,500 years before any of this happens. It'll be from your line that a king will come, and his royal line will never ever die out. That's a big call to make. Huge call to make. Fascinating that that's exactly what happens through David. David reiterates that promise and forms a Davidic covenant, or a special relationship with David, is probably a clearer way to say it. And then after David, who, was a really, really good king as far as the chronicler is concerned, he has a son called, and was he as good? He was pretty bad. But the chronicler, did you notice how he talked about Solomon? Solomon was still a pretty good dude, hey? Yep. Okay. Well, after Solomon, something happened, something very significant. Who's going to tell me what that is? The nation of Israel splits. 10 northern tribes of Israel, 2 southern tribes of Benjamin and Judah just become known as Judah. And under the leadership of the kings in the north, what happens to the northern tribes of Israel? They're all bad kings, and eventually God punishes them by what? Yes. Well, it's not really exactly exile. Because remember, with the Babylonian exile, it's like the group of people get picked up, gathered up, and carried off to another nation. But in the north, something specific happened. Cara, I know you know the answer.
They take only the good people.
Yes, no, that's true. Yeah.
Leave the weak and the...
Yeah, well, that happens...
And bring in others from other cultures.
That's the key, yes, yeah. So the taking the cream from the crop happened in the north and the south. But the Assyrians came in and took out some of the Israelites to spread them around the Assyrian Empire, but then took some Assyrians from all over the empire and put them in to sort of dilute the ethnic, their ethnicity. There you go. Under the rulership of the southern kings, it's slightly different. Who wants to fill everybody in on what happens there? Cara's picnic is up for grabs still, so. Oh, okay, Davey Walker. Yes. So sorry, what was that? There was 20 kings in the south, and there was
8 good kings.
Okay. So what happens as a result of 8 good kings?
The good kings get rid of all the bad stuff, and then bad kings do the bad stuff.
Okay, good. All right. But as a result of getting rid of some of the bad stuff and instituting some good stuff, God does something.
He promises they'll always be around.
Yes, that's true. But as a direct result of obedience, remember Deuteronomy 28, where we get this blessings and curses business? Come on, Carolyn, big voice. Oh, it's Karen. Yes! Yeah! And he blesses, absolutely. Now, this is so important that we get this, because I was thinking about it today. Hosea is a really good picture of this, but we could write a book or a movie or something that would go something like this. There was this particularly benevolent dad, and he had some kids, and he just lavished his love on them, and it was like the perfect kind of love, not sappy over the top. You can do anything, son. Nothing like that. It's like just a real good, loving dad who's willing to allow his kids to learn the right way, and he just pours his love on his kids. Yet shortly after the kids sort of growing out of their diapers, they start being really disrespectful to their dad, and he says, listen, you can't behave like that, I'm not going to put up with that kind of behaviour. But he still just continues to love them, and as they grow, there are fleeting moments of obedience, but generally they just totally diss their dad. And then and the dad's like, listen, you've got to understand, I'm your father, and I know what's best for you, and I'm going to have to give you a hiding if you carry on like this. And they're like, oh, sorry, Dad, I won't do that. And then they go and do it, and eventually the dad gives them a hiding. Now, at that point, you don't think, what about Dad? Yeah, man, geez, he's been patient. I would have given the kid up the backside ages ago. But then if you were to draw that story out over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that father continually just showing patience and continually looking for opportunities to bless his kids. You know, like they're the most repugnant children now you could possibly imagine. They're even killing their own kids and their grandkids, like literally doing that. You know, they're raping their sisters and they're killing their brothers and they're scheming and plotting. And their father, great-grandfather, I don't know, he's looking at all of this, just waiting for an opportunity to bless someone. And he sees someone who does the right thing or obeys him, and immediately he's on him like a rash. How can I now bless you? Like, that is the story of an incredibly loving God, an incredibly loving Father. Yet we read these stories sometimes and we see those moments where God his hand is forced to punish his people, and we think, oh man, this is a pretty harsh old God, isn't he? Forgetting that if we were in that position to extend the kind of love that he has time and again, it's like, no, we're reading this all wrong. And so we've got the 20 kings of Israel from the time of Rehoboam through to, what's his name? Hezekiah? Yeah, I think it's Hezekiah. It's not Hezekiah. Joachim, but then there's a Jehoiachin, and then there's one after that. No, he wasn't Chinese then. Okay. Irrespective, those 8 good kings, the moment they turned up, God wanted to bless his people. And so that's what he did. And it extended their time in the promised land. But, you know, God is a good God who keeps his promises, and he did say, listen, if you guys don't sort this out, you're going to cop a good and proper hiding. And that's what happens by way of the Babylonians. Now, we haven't got this far in the narrative yet. Well, that's as far as we've got in the narrative. The chronicler takes us a little bit further, really rapidly. And what's frustrating is, I'm not sure if we've got the slide here, we don't just yet. You'll notice that when we go into the poetry books, the books of the prophets, and even Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, what we need to do is we need to go and find those books and then plot them back somewhere in this line of the kings to find their historical and cultural context. Because some of the prophets will be speaking to the kings in the north, some will be speaking to the kings in the south. Some are from the south and they go up to the north to speak to the north. Okay? Some of the books are going to be taking place, the narrative is going to be taking place whilst in Babylon, in exile, and some is going to be taking place like on the way out of Babylon, back to Jerusalem. Which is where we can see God fulfilling his promise that Tom brought up a little while ago, that he would never, ever prevent his people from fulfilling all those, or from being blessed by those promises that he originally gave to Abraham, despite their disobedience, despite the fact that they willingly divorced themselves from God, he would keep a remnant. And in the prophets, we're going to hear a lot about this remnant language. All right. So we've come to the sort of the end of the story in Chronicles, where the people from Jerusalem have been taken over to Babylon here, and under the leadership of a new empire, the Persian Empire, they are told that they can go back. And they've gone back. They're looking at their desolate city. They're looking at their ruined temple, and they're thinking to themselves, like, where's God? We've come back, and it's like this temple is like, because that's where God was, right? Remember, they don't think like us, like that God's omnipresence or that God's spirit would dwell in us. They're thinking the presence of God, you know, is evidenced by a plume of smoke coming out the top of the temple. And they're looking at this temple and they're trying to patch it back up. And they're like, man, how are we going to get God back? And where's our king? What happened to our king? Wasn't there meant to be this scepter that never left the hand of one of the line of David? So this is the context into which the chronicler is writing. And hopefully that will give us a little bit of a shua as we embark on our first activity, which is to look at the genealogies. Now, I know you didn't think that's what we were going to be doing, but this is important because we've talked about why would we read the genealogies, why would we put up the genealogies. An opportunity to be honest. Who read all 9 chapters of genealogies? Cara. Kate Karen Spickwick. What did she quickly? Who listened to it all? Oh, look at that. There's a few there. Did you fall asleep halfway through it too? Same. It's a bit easier for me because I was practicing this exercise through the week. If you guys hadn't read ahead, you might have been doing the same thing. Okay, what I want you to do on your tables is pick one of the 9 chapters as individuals, and you can partner up with someone if you feel more comfortable doing that. Just pick one of the chapters. I want you to read through it. I want you to find, hopefully, 3 names or geographical locations in the genealogy, and I want you, with the space provided, to just jot down everything that you can tell me about that name or that geographical location, and you can be prepared to blow your own mind with everything that you've learned over the past 6 months. Sing out if that doesn't make sense, and sing out if you don't have one of these learning guides. Does anyone not have? Chook doesn't have one? Okay, so I do actually have some more chocolate. I was being quite tight before the, more picnics. Okay, but you won't get the chocolate necessarily for speaking up. You need to impress me. Sorry? What do I need to do? You gave it back. How did
I
that?
was being nice.
Well, what did we learn in Kings? That being good doesn't necessarily. That's right. Okay. Sorry? I'm a reflection of him. Especially under this light. Hope you're not laughing at my bald head because I'm like Elisha as well. Okay. Like David. That's right. 1 Samuel 6. If you want any proof that David was a ranger, because he was, it's in the Bible. He was a ruddy complexion. Ruddy and good looking, actually. It goes hand in hand. Red, good looking. Okay. So, who's gonna? We'll start with David. It sounds like he wants to say something. What have you got for us? Just one of your guys. Nathan. Okay. So Nathan appears in the genealogy. What do you know about Nathan?
He called out David about Bathsheba.
Yep.
He did the history of the reigns of David and Solomon. He was involved in the music in the temple.
Yep.
And he presided over the anointing of Solomon.
Okay. So wow. There's some things there that I didn't know, and I immediately assumed that this was the Nathan. I was thinking Jonathan, Saul's son. So Nathan, that's right. He bails David up about Bathsheba. So who was Nathan? A prophet. Okay. Now, here's the trick. I don't know if you remember, we talked about Acts 9, where the Ethiopian eunuch is opened up in Isaiah, and Philip goes, all right, you want to know about Jesus? Start there. So how would you link this name in this genealogy to Jesus? Like, what's the fastest way you could get to Jesus from there? Oh, it's so good. So, okay, I'm trying to make like a concrete application to reading genealogies. Like, as you're reading through the genealogy, maybe why is it significant that Nathan's in there?
Well, he sort of, all I can say, makes up part of the picture. He's got to be in there. Of course, he's connected with David, and David's the classic connection to the New Testament.
Okay, that's some good stuff. All right, what about...
From Bethlehem, and Jesus was from Bethlehem.
Okay, good. Now let's think a bit more theological. Okay, so you've taken the historical path. So, what is this? What does Nathan reveal about God? You'll like this.
Could he be a representative of the Holy Spirit?
Well, definitely, absolutely, because remember, pre-Pentecost, the Spirit would come on individuals. But what his function, I'm thinking more specifically around the time of Bathsheba. He had a function which reveals something about God. Yeah. No sin will go unpunished. Yeah. So remember, these historical narratives aren't necessarily just telling us historical facts, but that it's revealing something, and this is what's most important, it's revealing something to us about God. Our God is interested in our sin, and he's interested in it not being there. And so he will use, and I mean, I think this is Romans, it's the Spirit that will convict us of our sin. So just from that one name, you got like 1,000 sermons you got for old mate out in the surf when he's, I don't know.
You only want to Google. Why did you choose that one?
Yeah. Well, but to be fair, would have you been able to link Nathan to keeping David accountable?
Oh, sure.
All right. Well, there you go. There's your link. There's your theological link, and you've even got your historical or family. No, it's more of a geographical link. You don't throw that thing. But whatever. That's awesome. Okay, we're going to keep moving. Who have we got on this table? Someone more room? No? Go, Joe.
Bathsheba, we do.
Okay.
Yep. The woman that David committed adultery with.
Yes.
But she sort of asked for it because she was up on the top of the roof bathing, like naked, but anyway. But she had no choice.
I agree. I totally agree. David was minding his own business. And Bathsheba's like,
It's all the time.
we're going to get you preaching at the next men's conference.
The child that was born due to the adultery was killed by God
Yes.
as punishment.
Mm-hmm.
But then she was the mother of Solomon,
Awesome.
who is in the genealogy of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Fantastic.
And, well, I had along the lines of Nathan as well. Nathan helped. Oh no, this was a different one. Nathan helped Bathsheba to confront David to make Solomon king in the end. You know, the other son was trying to become king.
She's quite pushy, really, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I like it. What about, you kind of did the link to Jesus there. I think Bathsheba even gets a mention in one of the gospel genealogies, which is what does that reveal about God? That he would use Bathsheba?
Yes. Even when people sin and everything, he uses anyone. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so what does that reveal about human beings?
that we're all capable of sin, and we're all forgiven, and we're all,
Okay, yeah, so on the one hand, we're all capable of sinning, but we're all capable of being used.
yeah.
Yeah. And really the difference in the individual is willing or not. Yeah. Okay. Awesome stuff. What have we got over here? The only time Sarah talks is when she's putting the heat on.
Yes, exactly.
Those Dackens, Finlaysons. Alright, it's one of you two. Sorry?
Yeah, we would do it together.
Okay, well you can be spokesperson.
But we would like, I literally picked the easiest one because I was like, I'm not going to remember. So I just looked at Abraham, Isaac, and Esau.
Big voice over at the back in here.
Just at Abraham, Isaac, and Esau.
Abraham, Isaac, and Esau. Okay, well,
There's
let's do Esau.
okay. Stole the birthright of Jacob. His twin was Jacob. And we had oh, the other way around.
Yes. So culturally, he was owed the birthright, being the eldest.
Yeah.
Yep. But then,
So is it Jacob stole?
yes, that's right. Yep.
So is Esau's the hairy one?
Red and hairy.
Okay.
So that's for anyone that's saying, well, like in the ancient Near East there were no rainers. When I say David was of ruddy complexion, but there was, because actually Esau means Red and hairy.
Well, then all this is about Jacob. Because I got it mixed up.
Oh, that's all right. Oh, well, tell us about Jacob then.
I think I've got, I don't know, I could have got so long. Yeah, they were twins, the second born. Is this right? Am I saying that right? Jacob, yeah. His mother told him to steal the blessing. He fled the country, was fooled into marrying the wrong daughter of another man, and then had to kind of do that extra 7 years.
Yeah. So Jacob races up to Haran, back to his, there's some relatives up there, and he likes the look of Leah. Likes the look of Rachel. See, just testing you. Correct. Rachel, but didn't like the way Leah looked at him. Is that right? Did anyone get that one?
Very low.
She had a bung eye. Someone liked it. Like I heard a genuine laugh. Was it you, John?
Scoffing.
Oh. Okay, give me a link to Jesus. You can do this. This is really easy. What do you mean?
Along the way.
He has a son called Judah. Is that what you're saying? And then he made a promise to that son. Mm. Sorry?
Wasn't his son, was it?
Yep. It was. We're talking about Jacob at the moment, aren't we? Yeah, Jacob's son. Jacob gets renamed Israel. Yep. He says to Judah, "Hey, listen, someone from your line." David pops up, and we all think, "Oh, it's going to be David." But what we know as Christians is it wasn't David at all. It was Sunday school. Yes, Jesus. Yes, good. Okay. Did I gave you a chocolate book? Do you like Turkish delight?
Yeah.
Okay, that was a sympathy job.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Anyone up the back want to have a go? The youth pastor.
I did about the Levites.
Okay.
So they were the offspring of Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, that was known as Israel. God chose them to be his special tribe. He said that they would not have any inheritance in the land that Israel would possess, because God would be his portion and inheritance. But they also got cities in the land where they could live, and they also were responsible with the work in the temple, alongside with the offspring of Aaron, the priests. That's it.
That's pretty good. Okay, now link me to Jesus.
I should plug that before.
Sorry, what were you speaking for? Jesus fulfilled many roles.
He fulfills the role of the Levites.
So he's our great high priest. Yeah.
Yeah, but the high priest was from Aaron, right?
Yes. So they were Levites still.
Okay.
Yeah. So they were still from the tribe of Levi.
Okay.
Was I think they are.
Yeah.
I've always they're few. Yeah.
So Jesus was the highest high priest, and the work he did was enough for us all.
Okay, so the annual celebration on the Day of Atonement, there was a sacrifice made by the great high priest. Yep, and then.
So what Jesus did, he took the place of the biggest high priest. Like he was like the ultimate high priest.
Yep.
So what he did, like he kind of know what us all go through. So he's able to connect to our failures. He's able to connect with our difficulties and temptations. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, now I'm happy to put the pressure on, well, you particularly, Marcus, because you know your stuff, and everyone else, just because, I don't know, I think it's healthy. This exercise, if you don't discipline yourself to do this, you just won't at home. You're going to be reading through Scripture, and you'll see, no, I think I'm doing that, or whatever, you just keep going. But remember, the author, the intention of the author here, and it's easier for the original audience, because we know they're looking for things that we're not necessarily trained to look for. They're being drawn into the story with all sorts of literary devices. One of the devices is that they leave out particular details. But wherever there is a detail put in, it is there for a reason. So no one of these names appear in the genealogy in an arbitrary sense. It's intentionally put there for a reason. And so when we get to things, okay, the Levites, it's so good that you have this wealth of information about the Levites, but it is our responsibility not to allow that to just sit up here and sort of, I don't know, collect dust. There has to be some kind of link to what this reveals about God, and then maybe secondary to that, what it would reveal to us. And because we live under the new covenant as followers of Jesus, it's revealing to us things about God the Father, but also God the Son, Jesus being the ultimate revelation of the Father. And so when we are looking through the Old Testament, I'm always asking you guys to forget what you already know and just try and keep in the forefront of your mind that which we have read through to this far, to try and discover what the story is revealing about the Father. But this exercise is like, well, we know what the Father looks like. We've got Jesus. And so how does that inform us about what these particular people or geographical locations or events are revealing about the Father? And there's something, really special about the whole priestly line and the tribe of Levi, for all sorts of reasons. And we don't have time to do that now. But I think ultimately that the great high priest assumes the role of sacrificial lamb and scapegoat. Like God could not reveal to us a more complete package of salvation that happens independent of any of our effort. There's just nothing we do in that process. He's the high priest, he's the sacrificial lamb, he's the scapegoat as well. And then he's the one that bears the weight of our iniquity. Okay, table up the back.
We had Nimrod.
Okay, tell us all about Nimrod. Tom?
He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And he also might be Gilgamesh.
He might what?
He might be Gilgamesh.
Okay, why is
I was reading
that?
about it a little while ago. It's like the earliest piece of literature we have from Mesopotamia. It's about a great king they had. But it links in really well with the story of Nimrod, who went off and founded the kingdom. And he may or may not be one of the Nephilim.
Okay. So you're making like massive references to things that we don't know about.
Yeah.
I'm surprised you didn't talk about Bugs Bunny. You think that was me? Tell us, Tom.
Okay. Everybody knows Nimrod is an insult, and the reason it's an insult is because Bugs Bunny called Elmer Fudd Nimrod. He was mocking him, calling him a mighty hunter, but nobody understood the reference, and now everybody thinks Nimrod is an insult.
I think it's fair that nobody knew, given that, again, like I said to you, the cartoon was written for 6-year-olds. Like they would be thinking, oh yes, that's right, Nimrod, mighty warrior. And Elmer Fudd, well, he's not that. How ironic. I love Bugs and sarcasm. Okay. All right. Well, what is that? What is that? That information's good. What good is it in your head?
If you look at what he did, he rebelled against God. And the whole reason we need Jesus is because we rebel against God. Like he founded a kingdom that was in rebellion to God. That's why Jesus came, to restore us even though we are rebellious.
Okay, so he's an archetype of a rebellious human.
Yes.
What separates his level of rebellion Well, what makes him more capable of rebelling to that degree than any one of us? That's humbling. It's like, do we believe that though? Like, is it something we honestly believe? That, like, so Nimrod was a personification of evil in the same way, maybe not to the same degree, but the same way that Pharaoh was a personification of evil, and then different characters throughout the story take on that personification throughout the narrative, and we look at them and we go, man, how horrible, how tragic. Maybe some of the Israelite kings, or even the Judean kings. Yeah, the judges, like the mincing up of the concubine who had been raped to death. And we go, how could that possibly have happened? Like, what was wrong with those people? Because, to be honest, I still read it and I think that, but I'm becoming increasingly aware that, I'm only a couple of poor decisions away from being that guy. Which I think could be a pessimistic way to view ourselves. If that was the only way we viewed ourselves, maybe. But that we've got, like the redemptive power of the Holy Spirit living in us is so mind-boggling that God would choose to reside in those that could be capable of such sin. In fact, Manasseh in the book of Kings from Judah, he was a bad king, right? Horrible, like one of the worst. What did we find out in Chronicles?
He got redeemed. He humbled himself.
Yeah, and as far as we can gather, it's not explicit in Scripture, but we think that Isaiah, one of the greatest prophets, one of the greatest writing prophets anyway, was sawn in half by Manasseh. What they would do is they would shove these prophets into hollow logs so they couldn't move, and they just get a saw out and saw him in half. That's that guy. He humbled himself and God said, okay, I'll have you. Crazy. So forgiveness, hey, it's good. All right. Well, I hope you guys have found some of that fruitful, and I would love to think that as you guys carry on in your personal devotion, and even just as we continue to wade through wade, probably not the right word, but race through the books of the Bible, that you might take an opportunity here and there to consider a character or an event and just try and link it in your mind, draw that link, like how does that reveal anything about God, and how does that reveal something about me, and where's the link to the gospel from there? Okay, now out of the genealogies now, if you did get a chance to read Chronicles or listen to it, you will have found that there were a number of times where there was content that was quite familiar, and then you might have even found a couple of accounts where you're like, I didn't know that's how the story went. Did anyone come across anything like that where they thought, hang on a second, there's a contradiction here? Okay, Joe, big voice.
It was the story of when David sinned, and he went and counted his fighting men. Yes, and in Chronicles it said that it was Satan who incited him. But back in, was it Samuel?
First Kings, the end of First Kings.
Yeah.
The end of Second Samuel. Sorry, you're right. Yeah.
It said it was God back then, but now it's saying that it's Satan.
Could there be two more opposing characters in Scripture? Is this a contradiction?
But there can't be contradictions. So what's?
This is good.
Does God allow Satan?
Sorry?
Does God allow Satan? So
It
is
said
God doing it?
the way it was worded, because I wrote it down, and it's just in Chronicles it says Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take the census. But in Samuel it said, again the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them.
I love it. So good. Okay, so this is a genuine wrestle, and it's an important one because it may inform the conversation that we've been having that really sort of heated up around Kings, I think. which was that could God send a spirit to harm Saul or to bother Saul, or was it God's spirit that was the angel of death back in Exodus that was killing all the firstborn? Like, is this God doing this? Like, that's the language of the author. But we've also learned that you can't just read a passage in isolation, and you can't just read a book in isolation. While it's true that the Bible is 66 individual books, they're not to be read individually. They're to be read like in the context of the greater story. And how many times have we got to the end of a story, the end of a book, and gone, oh, that didn't work out the way I thought it was going to work out. And then it's like the very next line, which is the first one of the next book, resolves the tension that was left in the previous book. And that happens like across authors. It's not just the one author sort of doing that kind of thing. So Chronicles now is informing us about some of the questions we had of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Okay, I'm not going to give you the answer because I would only be guessing. So I'm going to leave it up to you guys. Now, again, you can find a partner or you can do it by yourself. But just pick one of the passages. I'll put the passages up here in case you don't have a learning guide. You can pick one of the passages from Chronicles, read it. You might want to pick one where it's only a couple of verses, or if you feel like you can read quickly, get a whole chapter. And then weigh it against one of the parallel passages from either the prophets or the wisdom books or the narrative in Samuel and Kings. Okay. We'll do this for 5 minutes. Okay. Because we're just let's do the death of Saul. Did anyone choose the death of Saul? Okay. Oh, Tom, I don't want you. Anyone else? Sorry? Nicole did. Okay. Quietly now. Big voice, Nicole.
Well, I think the main thing we found was about the armor bearer. I think in the first, Samuel, it says he didn't want to kill Saul, and then in Chronicles it says he did.
It says that
Did you have it?
he didn't want to
in
die.
Chronicles. I don't think he wants to die. Yeah, I think he actually.
So yeah, so the armor bearer seems to be innocent in this. There's somebody else that gets involved.
Yeah, no, I think
Yep. So there was a Hittite soldier who had obviously joined forces with, I guess, fighting with, because they were fighting the Philistines, I think, at this point. So he must have come down from the north, joined up with the Philistines in the south. I don't know, maybe he was a paid mercenary. He's seen Saul, and he's gone, one of two things. Sweet, he's nearly dead, I'll kill him. And I'll take his crown, I'll take his armband, and I'll go and tell David, and David will be stoked. Or, he saw Saul fall on his sword, went and grabbed Saul's crown and his armband, went and told David, guess what? I just killed Saul. So that's the difference. Correct? Sorry, Thomas?
That wasn't in those passages.
No,
That's
that's in 2nd Samuel.
Oh, that's the start of the next Samuel, isn't it? Yes. All right. So there's three slightly different accounts then. Okay. Well, Tom, why don't you tell us what are the similarities indicate about purpose and themes?
They're almost exactly the same. There were really, really minor differences. So they might have just been taken from the same spot. They might have got a common source maybe.
Okay.
Purpose and themes. Couldn't say.
Okay.
It's that last paragraph in Chronicles. So Saul died because in Samuel it just ends it, and they fasted for 7 days. They brought him back, and then but in Chronicles it says so Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. So it's almost like the chronicler just reiterates, well, if you're bad, if you sin, God's going to punish you, get rid of you.
Give yourself a mighty high five.
Yourself.
Yeah. So now, so there is a specific angle that the chronicler is playing in this case. Now remember, when we go looking for themes in these books, we've got to do our best not to impose a theme. Oh, we've seen it once, let's go looking for it everywhere to see if we can find it there. But if that theme is repeated time and again, that's a pretty good indicator that informs us as to what the major overall thrust of the book is trying to tell us. And then we use that overall thrust as our sort of our polar north, so that every other thing that we read in context, understanding, well, the major thrust of the book has got something to do with potentially the idea that if you do the wrong thing, there's going to be consequences. Now we've got the privilege of having done every book after Deuteronomy, and remember the image of the goggles, like we're looking through the glasses of the covenant law when we read these books now, and so we know that's true. We know that the author is trying to communicate something about the behaviour of these characters, but unlike every other book, where the behaviour is described, and it's just left up to the reader to decide, well, was that good or bad, the chronicler takes it upon himself to start indicating whether or not something was good or was bad. You've experienced that, haven't you? You've read the actions of someone, you've gone like, so they were a godly person. Why were they doing that? Is that okay? Dave and I were just talking about some of the things that David did. It seems like it would have been disobedience. It's like, but he was meant to be the good king. We don't get any clear indication as to whether or not that's right or that's wrong. Well, here we have the chronicler willing to say, this is a result of Saul's sin. Okay. What's another good one? Well, who's got one that they wanted to talk about? Otherwise, I'll just pick one. Sorry? David, look, if you've got something to share, can you share it with the whole class? Does anyone?
I've got one.
Okay.
So God's promise to David, in that one, the chronicler doesn't say that Solomon was going to turn away from God. So it's sort of the opposite of what you were saying before.
Okay, so you're saying that
So in Samuel he says that this is all to do with building a house.
Yep.
But in Samuel it says that your son Solomon will turn away, but he'll come back. Whereas that part of it's missed out completely.
Okay, so this is good, right? So now it looks like, oh man, what Andy's saying? That doesn't make sense. What is the clear distinction that kings drew and Samuel drew between Saul and then David and his family?
He wasn't the chosen.
He's not the chosen one, because where's he from?
Saul.
From Benjamin, yeah. Saul's from Benjamin. So now the chronicler is willing to say the Benjaminite, he's a baddie. But we know Solomon's a baddie. And the chronicler is saying, he's good. So what's the chronicler playing at now? Sorry? Right, yes, right. And given the context that we now have, remember these are returned exiles. And they're trying to get their religious and political and national identity back. What's the chronicler trying to do? Carolyn? Hey? This is, yes, Joel, get rid of that one you got. You didn't deserve your one before you. You don't like chocolates? Oh, yeah. Okay, now so this is good. Now I know I'm leading you guys, but I want to try and tonight I'm hoping this is building some confidence in the fact that through conversation, like we can work this stuff out. Like the Bible's, it's an adult book and it's a complex book. I'm not arguing that. It needs to be. We need to read it with conscious of that, but it's not beyond anyone. You're right? And I think for too long we've just let the Old Testament sit there up on the shelf because it's like, oh man, who's going to be able to work that out? You all will. You're all doing it. Okay, we'll do one more and then, yeah, we'll do one more. Who wants to do one? 3, 2, okay. So, we've got the chronicle put right at the end, the very end of the Jewish ordering of the Hebrew Scriptures. But because we like to compartmentalize and categorize in the West, we've gone and put it here as a follow-on from Kings in what is probably the best historical ordering of the narratives, which is kind of helpful for our heads because we just like to read everything in a line. The problem is, then what we've got to go and do is put Ezra back in here somewhere, Nehemiah back in there somewhere, Esther back in there somewhere, Song of Solomon's back over here in Kings somewhere, Ecclesiastes and Proverbs sort of scattered everywhere, Psalms vastly sort of written around this period here. Then all of these guys, where are we going to put them? They've got to be plotted back up and through there, the same as the 12. Okay, so we try and make it all sort of like a succinct and ordered, and it's like, well, why? It doesn't work like that. When we understand the way that the original ordering has been put in place, we can see that Chronicles is this account from Genesis that covers absolutely every single book. Now, it doesn't quote from every single book, but it offers a commentary on what we've learnt thus far, and it ends with somewhat of a hopeful phrase, which is really important for there to be a little bit of hope here. Because we know the temple doesn't reach its glory as it did under Solomon. The presence of God doesn't come back. We don't have a king on the throne. Yet there is hope in the way that the chronicler is writing that there will be a Davidic king coming back. And that God hasn't done away with his people. And I think that's best reflected in the themes, that there is a continuity with the past that the chronicler is trying to document, especially when it comes to the rebuilding of the temple. We're going to learn all about how that took place in Ezra and Nehemiah. But also the legacy of God's covenant, highlighted by the emphasis of God's gracious provision for Israel in his election, in his choosing. And so the chronicler makes sure that everyone knows that God chose, where do we start with? Levi to be the priests, that David would be the king, and that Solomon would, this is coming back to what Carolyn was saying, Solomon would be king after him, and that Jerusalem was the geographical location of where God told his people that his promises would be fulfilled. And so they're back there for that. And they do at least start to rebuild the temple. Israel's law and her prophets were a major part of the covenant life and under the leadership of the house of David. What's important here to understand is that the chronicler's primary feature of the reign of every faithful Davidic king was his attempt to ensure compliance with the law. This is important. As they read through the good Solomon and the good David, even though we know they were bad and they did bad things, he tells the story of all the good things they did, never making excuses for their bad things, just not mentioning their bad things. And again, it's just a literary device. It's trying to use some historical events to educate his people, not about the virtue of David and Solomon, but the virtue of following God's law. And so as we move along, we find that the importance of obedience to the law and the prophets is way more important than having a temple or a king. So the people have come back to the land, they've got this dud sort of second temple version of what was originally really good, and no king, and the chronicler is saying, listen, the important thing isn't that you've got a king or that you've got a temple, but that you guys obey God's law. That should never surprise us, because God said, I'm happy with a tent. We know he said that. And he said time and again, just obey my law, and this is going to go sweet. You know, it was David's idea for a temple. Okay. Chronicles is written to sustain Israel's hope of the promised Messiah, the son of David. And so while these people have spent 70 years in exile, they're wondering, how is it that this tribe of Judah is going to, have some king raise up? And in Chronicles, we're not sure how that's going to work, but we do read in Ezra and Nehemiah how one of the prophets that returns, or one of the priests, I should say, that returns, is actually a priest from the tribe of Judah. And it'll be through him that, as we read from the Gospels back through the genealogies, that the seed can carry on and eventually Jesus will arrive. Okay, the Chronicles history is repeated reference to all of Israel. So this is another thing that confuses us, because we talk about the 10 northern tribes of Israel being carried off into exile, or being carried away into captivity, I should say, by the Assyrians. And it's like, wasn't the promises of God for all of Israel? Chronicles also makes mention, I don't know if you picked this up, but time and again, of Judah's encouragement to the northern tribes of Israel to come on down and worship in Jerusalem. And the Chronicles says, yeah, we had guys from this tribe and guys from that tribe. And all the Levites eventually came down, and some more tribes, So it's like the promises of God that some might want to argue could not be fulfilled because Israel has sort of evaporated into history are not true at all. Plenty of Israelites made their way down into Judah and joined the Judeans in Jerusalem. Okay, the genealogies there, we talked about that right at the top. And then the introduction of the speeches, not found in Samuel or Kings, that's referring back to the idea that the chronicler here was making the first attempt at maybe what could be described as a commentary of what has taken place thus far. And so it's important to read Chronicles, despite the fact that we feel like we get a lot of repetition, because the angle that the chronicler is coming from is really different to the angle that the author of 1st and 2nd Kings is coming at these historical narratives from. And in the same way, we talked about this with New Testament class. When we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's important that we don't get to the end of Matthew, go, that was pretty long, I'm not going to do that 3 more times, and then skip straight into Acts. There is a reason why there's 4 different Gospels. In fact, you might be surprised to know this, but there was an attempt, and I can't remember exactly when this was, but in church history, to syncretize those 4 Gospels and just make one Gospel of Jesus. And so the attempt was made, and it was used for a little while until people realised, hang on a second, like Matthew is written, it seems to be quite specifically for Jewish authors, for Jewish readership. And then Mark, seems to me that this is really written to like a group of sort of Gentiles. And then we have the different accounts of the same miracle, or the different retelling of the same parable. And there are different truths that are drawn from the same story. And it doesn't mean it's a contradiction. It's just that different people were looking at the same thing from a different angle. And so that's what Chronicles is doing. That's why it's important to read it. I hope you guys did get a chance to read it. If not, we're moving along pretty swiftly this week into Ezra and Nehemiah.
So
2 books, but they're nowhere near as long as 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So you can bang them on audiobook and listen to them 10 times this week. Everyone.